So, good morning everybody, good afternoon for you. I hope you can hear me well. I guess you had a long day already. It's a pleasure to meet you back in this virtual space provided by Shanghai University. Please, if there is any problem with the connection, with the audio, with the video, let me know and we'll try to adjust. Today is the third meeting of our advanced seminar in critical semiotics. We are exploring especially the concept of a semiotic ideology, and we are connecting this concept with two traditions. On the one hand, the tradition of a philosophical thought about the idea of ideology, on the other hand the way in which it has been interpreted by the School of Semiotic Anthropology at the University of Chicago and then in other centers. If you remember, the first lesson was devoted to an introduction to the concept of critical semiotics, to an investigation of what semiotics is about. Whilst in the second lesson we try to explore a little bit more the passage from a language ideology or linguistic ideology to semiotic ideology. And we received also a visit by another professor, Professor Jenny Ponso, who has pointed out the main important moments, the milestones in the history of the idea of semiotic ideology first, semiotic ideology afterwards. And then it has also provided an example of how ideology is important in the study of literature, for instance. Today I would like to talk about one specific aspect of the study of semiotic ideology, which is again a methodological aspect, but then I would like to proceed toward a more substantial content. I would like to talk about the problem of agency in semiotics. First of all, let me check whether you're all there and you're all hearing me. Please, if there is a problem with the connection, let me know. How do you study semiotic ideology? How do you study language ideology first? That was the content of one of the questions I received at the end of last seminar. Well, in the case of language ideology, if you conceive ideology as composed of explicit ideas, basically you ask the members of a language, a community of speakers, what are their opinions, what are their perspectives about a specific aspect of language. But then if you consider that, as most scholars do nowadays, language ideology is also composed by implicit ideas, then what you have to do is more complicated, because you have to gather fragments of discourse from a certain community of speakers, and then try to interpret it as expression, manifestation of a specific semiotic linguistic ideology. The same goes with a semiotic ideology, save that in this case the task ahead is even more complicated, because it is not sufficient to observe how people talk. It's not sufficient to observe how people speak in a community in order to understand what the semiotic ideology of this community is, how it is. You must observe also other semiotic manifestations, other semiotic expressions, other systems of science, and be able to set some criteria and principles of representativeness. So you must somehow be sure that what you are collecting, that the materials you are collecting are sufficiently representative of the object under investigation. So this is very complicated in the case of a semiotic ideology. You're probably familiar with the concept of semiosphere. Now, in the past lessons, I talked about Ferdinand de Saussure, who was the founding father of semiology, the Francophone France and continental Europe based school of semiotics. I talked about Charles Sanders Peirce, who is the American philosopher who has initiated semiotics, that is the Anglophone US and UK based school of semiotics. But there is a third scholar who is very important in the history of semiotics. This scholar is Yuri Mikhailovich Lotman. He is the founding father of the so-called school of Tartu. Tartu is a beautiful city in Estonia now, but Estonia was before part of the Soviet Union, and Yuri Lotman was a professor there for a long time, although he was a native of St. Petersburg in Russia. And he established a specific school of semiotics called cultural semiotics. You know, the point of cultural semiotics is that it does not inquire simply about science as single units. It doesn't inquire about fragments like fragments of discourse or texts like novels or movies or advertisement, but it develops a more all-encompassing view which seeks to understand how entire cultures work as signifying systems, how entire systems of science work as signifying systems. Yuri Mikhailovich Lotman is also considered as the one who first created the term and the notion of semiosphere. So what is a semiosphere? A semiosphere is the virtual, theoretical, abstract space in which cultures give rise to meaning, in which cultures produce, circulate, remember, transmit, but also sometimes delete, suppress, censor meaning. What is the origin of this name? Well, semiosphere as a term and as a concept originates from the word biosphere. Probably you're more familiar with the word biosphere. The word biosphere was created for the first time by the geologist and natural scientist Vernadsky, who was also Russian, and who conceived of the Earth, of the planet, of the system of living beings that exist in the environment of the Earth as a system, as a whole, adopting what is called from the philosophical point of view a holistic perspective. So for Vernadsky, it wasn't important to consider only individual species, only animals, only vegetables, only minerals, only human beings, but it was interesting to consider the interaction among all these elements. The interaction among all these elements was a fundamental and was even more important than the interaction between single unities, single units. So the biosphere is a concept that has now entered the global consideration. It is a term that is used even by common speakers, not only by natural scientists. But then Yuri Lotman, who read and knew Vernadsky, thought, oh well, but maybe I can adapt this concept of the biosphere to the social sciences, to humanities. Maybe I can think about meaning as something that emerges as well from a system, from a holistic organism. So the idea of LEONE was to treat culture as a whole as a system of signification, as a system where signs are created and circulate and are exchanged. And so it gave rise to a theoretical school, and I wrote many books about how the semiosphere works. So why am I talking about the semiosphere? Because in that case too, if you want to study, for instance, the semiosphere of a present-day China, if you want to understand how meaning is created in present-day China, if you want to understand how signs are created, circulated, exchanged in present-day China, where do you actually have to look at? You know, this is a very difficult question. So do you have to look at, for instance, movies that are produced in present-day China? Do you have to read novels that are written, published and read in contemporary China? Do you have to, on the contrary, consider everyday life? So the way in which people behave with each other, meet with each other, work in offices, enjoy their free time or leisure time in parks, the kind of sports they do. So you see, culture is such a complex, in all-encompassing organism, if it is an organism, that it is very difficult to find an approach, a suitable approach to the study of this system. And so at some stage in the history of cultural theory, the idea emerged that cultures might actually be a little bit like clouds, or a little bit like snowflakes. You know how a snowflake is from the topological point of view. I don't know if you have ever seen a snowflake at a microscope, or if you have seen some diagrams showing the inner structure of a snowflake. How is the structure, the diagrammatical structure of a snowflake? Well, it is the snowflake, which is this polygonal figure with many sides and a perfect symmetry. But if you look into one part of this diagram, if you look at the fragment of a snowflake, you realize that this fragment has exactly the same topology, the same structure, the same geometrical structure of the whole. So this is, in a nutshell, in few words, what a fractal is. So the same goes for other natural objects, for instance clouds. You know, clouds, if you analyze their inner structure, their inner topology, you'll see that a cloud has a structure as a whole, but then within the cloud you'll see other geometries that are exactly like the general geometry but on a smaller scale. The same goes for cauliflowers, the same goes for many natural elements that have this fractal configuration. So fractal configuration means that the whole has a certain geometry, the whole has a certain structure, but parts, fragments of that whole present the same structure as well. You know, and of course there are different kinds of fractal similarity. The mathematician who first developed this branch of mathematics, this particular trend in topology. Topology is the study of geometrical space which undergoes transformation, in a few words. was a mathematician called Mandelbrot. So why am I talking about this mathematical concept, the concept of fractal? Well, I'm talking about it because one of the hypotheses of cultural semiotics is that culture is also endowed with a fractal structure, with a fractal configuration. It might work as a fractal too. What does it mean? It means that in culture too, in a semiosphere, that is in the abstract semiotic diagram that seeks to understand how a culture works, in a semiosphere too, there might be a fractal configuration. So the semiosphere, the culture as a whole signifying system, as a whole meaning producing system, has a certain structure, but if you look into the parts, if you look into the fragments, you might be able to find the same structure as well. So this means that there might be a correspondence between the general laws that determine the functioning of a semiosphere, that determine the ways in which a semiosphere gives rise to meaning, to the circulation of meaning in a society, and the ways in which a fragment of the semiosphere works, meaning, for instance, the ways in which a text is arranged. So this hypothesis, which is a high hypothesis, of course, it cannot be considered as a pure fact. It is a hypothesis that must be tested, verified, investigated, deepened. If this hypothesis is correct, then in order to understand something about culture, in order, for instance, to understand what is the semiotic ideology that is predominant in a certain semiosphere, I'm not necessarily bound to an inductive method. What is an inductive method? Well, inductive method would be that I read and analyze all the novels that have been published, and read in China in 2019 or in 2020, in order to reach some conclusions about how literature in China in 2019 or 2020 is, in order to understand something general about the functioning of meaning making processes in contemporary China as regards literature. This is an inductive methodology. It is an inductive procedure. It is a way of studying culture through accumulation of data, and this is something that quantitative studies do. For instance, studies that stress the importance of empirical evidence, work more and more with big data, work more and more with software for automatic analysis of data, and so on and so forth. This is a praiseworthy approach that sometimes produces even interesting results, but it's not the typical approach. It is not the typical perspective, methodological perspective of semiotics and cultural semiotics. Cultural semiotics is not necessarily quantitative. It is not necessarily inductive. Cultural semiotics, as it was conceived by Lotman, does not say, okay, now we study and read all the novels produced in China in 2019, so we'll understand something about China today. This is not exactly what cultural semiotics says. On the contrary, cultural semiotics says that, suggests, indicates, points out, insinuates that there might be something a little bit simplistic and naive about this inductive way of accumulating information. Accumulation of information does not always give rise to knowledge. Indeed, I might come across Series B novels, small novels, which do not actually have any particular import as regards knowing what kind of literature is produced in China today and what it means. What is much more important, according to cultural semiotics, is that I select a representative corpus of novels out of the thousands that are produced in China in 2019 or in 2020 or in any possible year. I don't study all of them superficially. I study some of them in depth, and I choose those that, according to my reading, according to my hypothesis, might have a fractal relation with the whole that the cultural semiosphere of today China is. So, according to this hypothesis, I approach the study of culture by selecting a corpus that might be representative of some dynamics, of some processes, of some characteristics that are particularly present in contemporary China, and I analyze through semiotics those texts, the texts in my corpus, in order to understand something more general about the culture I'm investigating. Now you will ask probably at this moment, how do I know which texts, which novels, which movies, which symphonies, which everyday behaviors I'm supposed to select? Is this not a subjective choice? Is this not a choice that depends on the subjectivity, or at least on the intuitions of the researcher? Well, in a way, the intuitions of the researcher are important, because in order to be able to correctly read the signs that the culture produces, I must also have a general idea of that culture. I must be able to create connections between phenomena that are apparently far from each other, and I must also be able to, in a way, consider that the semiotic perspective will allow me to see some aspects of this semiosphere that are not visible to other more traditional disciplines. So this is how the semiotic ideology of a semiosphere is supposed to be studied as well. So in order to understand what is the semiotic ideology of China today, in other words, in order to understand how China and Chinese people nowadays consider implicitly or explicitly meaning, implicitly or explicitly entertain ideas about what is meaningful, what is meaningless, how meaning is produced, how meaning is erased, how it circulates, what is the place of meaning in society, and so on and so forth, I must somehow select a corpus of texts, a corpus of representations that might be representative and indicative of this semiotic ideology. Of course, I cannot study semiotic ideology as a whole. I must concentrate on certain specific aspects of semiotic ideology. So I cannot ask the question, okay, what is meaning in China today? Because this is a too general question. I must somehow divide this question into smaller questions, into questions concerning aspects of the production and circulation of meaning in today's China. And there are some lines that I can use. For instance, I can rely on some traditional philosophical categorizations in order to structure my investigation about meaning and meaning ideologies. Now today, for instance, I would like to propose an example An example that is familiar to you, but also familiar to me as a viewer, as a researcher, as an observer, and concerns a specific aspect of the semiotic ideology of a semiosphere, an aspect that is absolutely central. And this aspect is the aspect concerning agency. Agency. You have probably heard about this concept, the concept of agency. What is agency? How could you define agency? What is the Chinese word translating the English word agency? You see, the English word agency is not so easy to translate in other languages. Even in Italian and in other languages, European languages, agency is often designated with the same English term, the term of agency, because it's a technical term. It's a term that is central in the contemporary philosophy, in philosophy of mind, in cognitive philosophy, but also in semiotics, contemporary semiotics. So what is agency? How could we define agency? And what is the relation between agency and the semiosphere? Or more precisely, what is the relation between agency and a semiotic ideology? Now, agency, to give a very simple definition, but of course there are many philosophical schools that debate about how to better understand this concept. Agency is the capacity of acting into the world. Agency is the capacity of affecting the world, of changing the world, of exerting an impact in the world. So having agency means being able of changing the world through acts and actions, including those particular acts that are the so-called speech acts, so acts and actions that change the world through words, through the discourse, through science. So I hope this is quite clear. So it's a general abstract concept, but it is of tremendous importance. Agency, once again, is the abstract philosophical idea of being able of acting into the world, of changing the world through acts, of affecting, conditioning, influencing the world through acts. So, in order to understand a little bit more directly what agency is, let's consider a very simple example. Does my computer have agency? Does my computer, the computer through which I'm talking to you, have agency? Well, if this question was asked in the 1980s, when my computer was a very simple computer, there was no internet, my computer was not connected to the world, was not connected to other computers. It was operating through a very simple operating system that was called, as a result of this simplicity, BASIC, one of the first programming languages for computers. Then in the 1980s I would immediately say, no, well, this computer is just a machine, does not have any agency. This computer is a sophisticated tool, is a sophisticated piece of inorganic materials put together, silicon, steel, plastic, in order to enable me to perform some actions in the world. So I'm the one with agency. I'm a human subject with agency, because I'm the one who can act into the world. I'm the one who decides, okay, I want to write to my professor now, I want to write to my student now, and I use this tool, I use this computer in order to produce this effect into the world, in order to change the world according to my desires or my intentionalities and my intentions. But what about asking the same question today about my computer? Now I'm in front a MacBook Pro computer, which is a tremendously sophisticated machine if you compare it with the computer, the machine that I was using in the 1980s. So if I ask this question again, is this computer in front of myself endowed with agency? Well, probably out of habit and out of tradition, mental tradition, my initial answer would be, I would initially say, no, this computer has no agency. This computer is not able to act into the world on its own. This is exactly like my computer in the 1980s. I'm the one who decides. I'm the one with intentionality and agency. I can act autonomously into the world. This computer can't. So I decide that today I'm going to give my seminar for my students in Shanghai, but it's not the computer that decides it. You know, the computer is just a tool, it's just an instrument. But is this answer really correct? Can I say about my computer today that it shows the same complete lack of agency, absence of agency, that my computer would display in the 1980s? Can I answer in the same way, given that today this complex, a Mac computer that is in front of me, is endowed with extremely complex systems that I cannot possibly know, that only very advanced engineers around the world, very few of them actually, can master? Can I still reply that my computer has no agency, given that this computer is now endowed with algorithms that I do not know, and nevertheless constantly influence my everyday life by suggesting to me, for instance, songs that I should listen to, videos I should watch, articles that I should buy? Moreover, am I entitled to answer the same answer to the question of agency, given that now this computer is not isolated anymore? It is not like my computer in the 1980s. It is connected into a giant network of computers all around the world, whose stretch I cannot possibly know, and whose thin inner articulations are mostly ignored by me. I do not completely know with which external networks my computer is now communicating, because my computer is doing it now behind my back. So I don't know what kind of information now my computer is giving to the world about me, about myself, about my house, about what I'm saying, about what I'm doing, about what is inside the memory of my computer, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I might try to protect my computer from external agencies, but it is a fact that every time that we go on the internet, we have what is called a digital print. We start leaving traces in the world, and we start also leaving traces into the world for the benefit and the interpretation of other agents. So you see, if in the 1980s I could think that my computer was just a hammer that was a little bit more sophisticated than a hammer, so you know what a hammer is, no? It's something that, you know, can be used to just put some nails into the walls when I have to hang my paintings. Well, in the 1980s, I could have said, okay, my computer is a kind of hammer. It's a little bit more sophisticated, but it's a hammer. You know, I switch it on and switch it off and so on and so forth. But can I say it now? Can I say right now that my computer is a sort of a hammer? Can I say that the agency of my computer is exactly like the agency of a hammer? I cannot say it anymore. Because you see, a hammer is completely devoid of agency. A hammer is something that does not work in the world if there isn't any agent, presumably a human agent, that operates it. But my computer works into the world without me. My computer works and produces algorithms that I do not know. There are myriads of bots into the world, that is pseudo subjects like trolls, for instance, that constantly interact with me, but are actually produced by machines. Financial exchanges, stock markets are full of operations that are not decided by human agency. Human agency is less important into the world than it was in the 1980s. The agency of complicated machines, the agency of algorithms, is actually becoming more important. So this is to say that the question of agency is central in order to understand many aspects of everyday society, but it is also something that is not only a matter of empirical evidence. It is also a matter of ideology. So if I think of my computer today as of a sort of a tool deprived of any autonomous agency, is because I still have, that is because I still have in my imagination, in my imaginary, in my culture, an old idea of computers. I still have the idea of computers in the 1980s. I still think that computers work with a machinic intelligence. But now technology has evolved. Computers are also endowed more and more with artificial intelligence. And what is more, this artificial intelligence is becoming less and less artificial with the passing of time. On the one hand, my natural intelligence, my human intelligence, your human intelligence, everybody's human intelligence is becoming more and more artificial. Why? Well, you know, please raise one's hand, the one who has never talked to a machine as if it was a human being. You know, I constantly talk to my iPad, I constantly talk to my computer, I constantly say the magic word. If I now say, hey Siri, my iPad, my MacBook Pro will answer asking me what I desire, what I want. So we now talk to machines, and our ways of talking to the machines is adapting to the ways in which machines work. So we are also developing a sort of artificial intelligence. Moreover, sometimes the ways we talk to human beings is being influenced by the way in which we talk to machines. So our artificial intelligence is trained by machines, but is becoming more and more present also in human interactions. In many human interactions, for instance, I don't care anymore if I do not understand the other person, as long as we can coordinate. And this is exactly the definition of artificial intelligence, the fact that I do not actually comprehend the machine does not comprehend me, there is no mutual understanding, and there is no empathy, of course, but we can coordinate. You know, I can coordinate with Siri, the artificial intelligence agent of my computer. Now, this kind of perception of agency as coordination without understanding, without comprehensions, without empathy, is also somehow being transmogrified and transferred as regards in the frame of relations among human beings. more and more, I do not actually care if I do not understand other people, if I do not comprehend them deeply, if I do not actually understand or feel their feelings, as long as I'm able to coordinate with them in an effective way, which is pragmatically suitable to carry on my tasks and my goals. So this is a completely different way of understanding relations among human beings than the ways in which human beings were conceived as relating to each other before the invention of artificial intelligence. This is to say that the concept of agency is fundamental. We defined agency as the capacity to act, of acting into the world, but this concept, this notion is not stable. It is not always the same. It is evolving through time. It is evolving throughout history, and it is evolving also as a consequence of the technological evolution. So the notion of agency that we have nowadays is somehow a reminiscence, a heritage of another historical and cultural epoch, a cultural epoch in which artificial intelligence was very basic or was not developed at all, but now we interact with our machines in a way that is actually contradicting that concept of agency. Our machines do have agencies more and more. Our algorithms change our life. They can actually create financial crashes around the world. They can determine what we buy, what we desire, what we listen to. They can shape our taste. So we cannot say anymore that this machine that I have in front of myself is just a machine. First of all, because I look at the screen of this machine more than I look at any other human being, included members of my family. But also because this machine is now answering back. It is now acting into the world. Now you might say, okay, but anyway, someone, an engineer, has programmed this machine. Someone, an engineer in Cupertino or an engineer in China, has devised this algorithm. So this machine is just a reflection of what the engineer or what a company wanted. This is not completely true. It is true only to a certain extent. You see, engineers create algorithms and they try to create them so that they work at their best. But then the ways in which these algorithms behave into the digital world is not always completely in line with how they were programmed. So somehow their behaviors escape the framework that was programmed and planned beforehand for their action. So what is the definition of something that you create but then escapes from your control? This is not something that happens with a hammer. You know, a hammer, you create it and it behaves exactly as you want it. This is not something that applies to a car. You know, a car, especially a car of, let's say, the pre-digital generation, would behave exactly as the driver would like it to behave. But what about an automatic car? What about a car like Tesla endowed with an automatic artificial intelligence driving system? Can we still say that this product of my creation is abiding by the rules that were set by the creators? That is not the case. In many circumstances, algorithms, complex algorithms, develop their own behaviors into the world, into the digital world. And the definition of something that we create but then escapes our control is the definition of a creature. This is how human beings are. You know, you have children, you educate them, you try to educate as best as you can, but then inevitably they do what they want. Sometimes they escape completely your control. Sometimes they do exactly the opposite than you expected them to do, because this is how human beings are, because they are endowed with agency, autonomous agency. So we're now taking a break, a 10 minutes break. We're going to resume at past 5, and after the break we're going to talk more about the concept of agency, but in relation to the specific Chinese cultural context. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in 10 minutes. So welcome back after our 10 minutes break. I hope you can hear me. So in the first part of the class we have introduced the concept of agency, which is one of the elements we should consider when we study the semiotic ideology of a culture, the way in which a culture produces meaning, understands meaning, conceives of meaning within the framework of the semiosphere, which is the abstract a topological diagram, the abstract framework within which Yuri Mikhailovich Lotman and a school of cultural semiotics of Tartu and Moscow conceives of semiotics. I've also tried to point out to you through a simple example that the concept of agency, we can of course philosophically define it, but then when the discussion bears on how agency is conceived in a certain culture, and how, most importantly, is attributed to the elements that compose the human environment, then we must realize that there is an evolution. There is change in time. So the way in which we attribute agency is not always the same in time. You know, think about the ways in which we attribute agency to animals which are not human beings, to the way in which we attribute a capacity of acting into the world to other animals or even to plants. You know, there are many people now that fight for the rights of animals, that are vegetarians, that believe that non-human animals also have rights, and so on and so forth. There are people who also believe that plants have rights, that they have their own agency, their own capacity of acting into the world. So this is something that is a product of a cultural evolution, and the same cultural evolution affects also the agency that we attribute to inanimate objects. You know, there are certain objects in the past that would be considered as capable of agency, and now they're not anymore. You know, like, I don't know about China. I think China too is a country that is characterized by a certain superstition. You know, I'm Italian, as you know, and Italy, especially southern Italy, is a very superstitious country. So we have a lot of superstitions. So you are not supposed, for instance, to leave an umbrella open at home. You know, this is considered as a bad sign, bad omen, and something that might actually bring you bad luck, misfortune in your own life. It is, of course, a thought that is considered nowadays as completely irrational. You know, there is no rational causal scientific link between the fact of opening an umbrella at home and having some bad luck. But nevertheless, in traditional Italian thought, this umbrella is considered as a kind of an object endowed with agency. So if you leave an umbrella open at home, that object, which is a simple object in traditional Italian superstitious culture, might actually exert a bad influence on your life. You know, this is typical of the so-called magical thought. You know, the thought that inanimate objects might actually affect your life. This is a conception of agency that is now considered as irrational, obsolete, the product and the characteristic of another epoch. And we can even, from an anthropological point of view, try to explain why people would believe such nonsense, how we would define it nowadays. We might think, for instance, that, well, umbrellas have not always existed. Of course, they are a product of the human invention, the human imagination. They have been produced in order to protect human beings from potentially dangerous external agents, mostly weather. So I use an umbrella in order to protect myself from things that fall from the sky. I protect myself with an umbrella from the rain, from the snow, from hailstones. But also, for instance, in China, if you go through the campus of Shanghai University on a sunny day, you're going to see many students, especially girls, who hold some umbrellas, especially white umbrellas, in order to protect themselves from, again, something that comes from above, that is excessive heat and excessive sun rays. And the shape of the umbrella is meant to serve this function, but it is also such that the function becomes a meaning. So the umbrella is a functional object, but when I see someone wearing a closed umbrella, I immediately transform that umbrella into a sign. I immediately think, oh, that person thinks that it might be raining. Or I might think, okay, maybe it might be raining, I'm gonna take an umbrella too. So you see, it is a functional object, but it is turned by society into a sign. So as a consequence, when I leave an umbrella open at home, I might somehow imply that this home, this family, might need protection from something dangerous that might happen. But that's why umbrellas at home should not be open, at least in Italy, because home, the house, the family, is already seen as a place of protection. It is already seen as a shelter, as something that has a roof above. So it's the roof that protects the family. And I'm not supposed to open an umbrella, because opening this umbrella means that something that is more powerful than this roof will happen to this family, something that we cannot actually stem through the shelter that we have provided to this family. So this is just a silly example to make you understand that the concept of agency evolves throughout time, because we used to traditional cultures used to attribute agency to inanimate objects, like an umbrella, for instance. But then nowadays this is considered as pure superstition. But at the same time, we are now going back to giving agency, attributing agency to other inanimate objects, not out of superstition, but out of technological evolution. So we talk to our computers, we talk to our phones answer back. More and more these machines can autonomously move around the world, and robots are becoming more and more sophisticated to the point that the whole phenomenon of the uncanny valley is being developed. So the fact that some robots are sophisticated to the point and are acquiring a human morphology to the point that we are not so certain anymore about where the inanimate starts and when the animate stops. So this gives us that feeling of uncanny, this quietness that is typical of the uncanny valley, is typical of the human reaction when dealing with cyborgs, humanoid robots and other creatures of this kind. But in the second hour, 45 minutes of our lesson of today, I would like to point out that the semiotic ideology of agency changes not only throughout time, so agency is not attributed in the same way today as it was in the past in Italy or in China, but it evolves also through space. So cultures might differ, might be different from each other, sometimes in radical ways, as regards the attribution of agency to some elements of the environment. Now, let me introduce a second example, or a third example. We talked about computers in the 1980s, and nowadays we talked about umbrellas. Let me talk about something that I discuss quite frequently with my Chinese students and colleagues. You see, the first time I went to China, I believe it was 2008. It was for out of personal reasons, because an uncle of mine, my mother's brother, used to live in Shanghai. He had a restaurant in Shanghai, an Italian restaurant, Italian-French restaurant, which is still there, although he is not the owner because he moved elsewhere, he moved to another country. Since 2008 I've gone to China many times. Then I've started working with several universities in China, Nanjing Normal University, Sichuan University, and above all Shanghai University. And in my free time, of course, I've visited, I've explored, and I've visited, among other things, parks. China has beautiful parks. Visiting the parks of Chinese cities is always, to me, such a joy. They have a special appeal to me. Of course, there is something familiar in these parks, because there are parks also in Italy or in Europe, but there is also something exotic, something that is different. Well, of course, plants might be different, you know, the trees, the flowers, natural elements that are present in Chinese parks might be different from those that are present in Italian or European parks. But there are also some subtler cultural differences that you do not notice at the first sight, you notice after a while, and you cannot always explain so easily. Okay, well, the fact that in Chinese parks there are certain plants or flowers or trees instead of others might simply depend on the weather, the fact that the weather affects the fact that certain plants are more resistant and thrive more in certain parts of the world instead of others. But there was something when I was visiting Chinese parks that would always surprise me. You see, I'm in Turin right now. If I walk like less than 200 meters from my house, there's a beautiful park, and this park is called Valentino Park. It's the biggest park in Turin, the city where I spend most of my time, live and work. If you walk through this park, as I do several times per week, you're gonna come across trees, plants, flowers, but also people, of course, with their dogs, etc. But you're gonna also come across beautiful fountains. Old fountains that were built like more than 1 century ago, that are sometimes monumental with statues and elaborate architectures. But fountains are very important in Italian parks. Fountains are something that you come across almost systematically when you walk through an Italian park. The same goes for many European parks. Now, something that I realized was striking me, although I was not aware of it, was the fact that in many Chinese parks that I was visiting, in Shanghai, in Hangzhou, in Nanjing, in Suzhou, in Chengdu, and so on and so forth, these beautiful parks would never have a fountain. There were no fountains. Now, let's put this consideration aside for a moment. So, what are we doing here? How are we proceeding? Well, basically, we're doing something that semioticians do all the time. They perceive a difference that everybody is able to perceive, but not everybody actually pays attention to it. And not everybody, moreover, attributes a specific meaning to this difference. So this is what we have done so far. We have walked as simple observers through a Chinese park, and we have compared it, comparison, fundamental tool of cultural theory and knowledge and history, to an Italian park, and we have noticed a difference. Now, we have noticed this difference also because our mindset is not a common mindset. We are not common observers. We are observers that somehow have a certain sensibility, a certain more acute sensibility to spot differences between cultures and cultural environments. So we have realized this difference. Fountains in Italian parks, fountains in European parks on the one hand, and no fountains in Chinese parks on the other hand. But we still do not know whether this difference is important or not. And we do not know why this difference is there. And moreover, we do not know what meaning this difference has or should have or might have for us. We cannot answer this question. What does it mean? What does this difference mean? Because we still do not have enough elements, you see. The difference that we have spotted is still too elementary and too simple. We must somehow connect this observation with other elements, with other observations concerning the comparison between Chinese culture and European culture. Now, you see that Italy and China have something in common that other countries and other cultures do not have. We are tremendously passionate about food. This is a point of contact which is very strong between our cultures. Italians are obsessed about food. They talk about food all the time. They think about food all the time. They prepare food all the time. When they want to show affection, they offer food, and so on and so forth. As they are eating, while they're eating, they talk about the food that might be prepared in the future, that was prepared in the past. So it's the most common conversation subject. In China, too, food is fundamental, is central, is a central element of everyday life and culture. And the Chinese food culture is among the most successful in the world. You know, there are Italian restaurants everywhere in the world, but there are also Chinese restaurants everywhere in the world. Now, of course, if you go to a Chinese restaurant in Turin, you might have different experiences. First of all, let me say there are many Chinese restaurants in Turin, and there are different kinds of Chinese restaurants. So there is, on the one hand, Chinese restaurants that somehow translate Chinese food for the Italian taste. And there you might be amused, but also a little bit disappointed, because you're not going to find Chinese food as you know it. You're not going to find regional Chinese food, food from Sichuan, food from Nanjing, and so on and so forth. You're going to find a translation, but also a little bit of a stereotype of Chinese food abroad. But there are other restaurants as well, because there is a big, thriving, beautiful Chinese community in Turin, and many Chinese students, thousands of Chinese students. So now, just one block far from my house, there are many Chinese restaurants that are actually pretty, let's say, similar to the ones that you would come across in China. But if you go to the first kind of restaurants, the ones that somehow translate Chinese food for the taste of Italians and so project a sort of a stereotype of Chinese food abroad, there is one element in the decoration of the restaurant that you will always come across. There is a piece in the decoration, in the furniture, that you will always come across, something that you will never come across in Italian restaurants, in restaurants of Italian food. And it's actually something that you find only in Chinese restaurants. This element is usually a landscape painting, a big landscape painting. And in this landscape painting, you have a special effect, a special optical effect, sometimes with backlight, with a light that is behind the painting and gives light to the representation of the painting, in order to represent, in particular, one element of this landscape. And this element is the waterfall. There are no Chinese restaurants that have been in Italy or in Europe that do not have a painting representing a waterfall. So you see, now we have another important element of comparison, because beforehand we observed that Chinese parks do not have fountains, but European parks constantly have fountains. On the other hand, we are also observing something that is apparently very distant and apparently does not have any relation to the first observation, but we'll see that actually through cultural semiotics we can connect elements that seem to be very far away from each other. So the second observation is that in Chinese restaurants abroad, we always come across these light paintings, and these paintings with a fluorescence effect constantly represent a waterfall. But then we think, well, wait a moment, because it's true that all these parks I've visited in China did not have a waterfall, but they all or almost all had a waterfall. They didn't have a fountain, sorry. All these Chinese parks I visited did not have a fountain, but they all had a waterfall. So what does it mean? Because on the contrary, most of the European parks I visited, for instance, this one in Turin, do not have a significant waterfall. So you see, we are little by little, through observation and comparison, guided by a semiotic mindset, starting to build a system, a systematic structural comparison, which is based on elements that are present or absent in the two cultures that we are comparing. So this is a typical structural Levi-Straussian, you know Levi-Strauss, the founding father of structural anthropology, a system of opposition. Chinese parks, no fountains, yes waterfalls. Italian parks, yes fountains, no waterfalls. It is the complete opposite. But what does it mean? Well, we might stop our observation and our consideration there. We might actually think that, well, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a coincidence. It's just custom. It's just fashion. It's just how it goes, the way it goes in the two countries. But as semioticians, we are always dissatisfied with the simple description of cultures. So we are not satisfied by simply describing how cultures are, because we want to inquire about the why. Why is that so? Why? And above all, the final question is to what effect? To what semiotic effect? What is the meaning of that? What is the meaning of placing fountains in a park? What is the meaning of placing waterfalls in a park? What is the meaning of not placing fountains in a park? And what is the meaning of not placing waterfalls in a park? You see, in our semiotic exploration, we might also be helped by not only, let's say, observation and cultural semiotics, but also by history. So we realize through our knowledge of history that actually there are some parks in China, in Beijing for instance, which used to have some fountains. But if we look into the history of these parks, we realize that these parks were built toward the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and were built when the Chinese economic and political power was actually absorbing skills and competencies from Europe, from the rest of the world. So if you look at the history of these parks, these Chinese parks, which used to have fountains, you realize that the architects of these parks were not Chinese. They were, for instance, Jesuits. There were a Western and in some cases also Italian architects who would be contracted by the Chinese emperor in order to show that Chinese parks would be to the level of the parks, the great parks of Europe. It was an operation of cultural import. So architects, ideas, but also fountains were imported into Chinese parks, but they were not a traditional element of it. This is another element that adds to our knowledge of this difference. But then this doesn't really answer our question, the question of why is it so? Why is it that in Chinese traditional parks there are no fountains and there are waterfalls, and why in traditional European parks there are waterfalls, there are fountains but there are no waterfalls? What does it mean? Well, in order to answer, we cannot look at this opposition in purely descriptive terms. We must introduce a consideration of the semiotic ideology that is behind fountains, that is behind waterfalls. What is a fountain? A fountain is not a functional object. It is not there because it has a functional purpose. Nobody's gonna drink from that monumental fountain. Nobody's gonna swim in that fountain. That fountain is there to mean something else. Well, of course, you might say, yeah, the fountain is there in order to produce a feeling of beauty, a feeling of aesthetic harmony. But this is not enough for us to know, because we might inquire also about the deep, profound roots of that aesthetic feeling.
Why is it that going to a European park and coming across a fountain, we feel that that fountain is beautiful? What is it in European, Italian culture that pushes us to believe that that fountain adds actually some beauty to the park? And if it does actually add that beauty to the park, how is it that the same does not happen in a Chinese park? How is it that Chinese do not actually think that the fountain would add something particularly beautiful or enhancing to their park? And the opposite with a waterfall. Why is it so important? Why is it that a Chinese visitor to a park looking at a waterfall thinks that a waterfall adds something particularly harmonious and praiseworthy and beautiful to the park and the experience of going through the park? So, you see, we are exploring not only comparative cultural theory, we are exploring comparative aesthetics. We are wondering about the deep roots of differences in aesthetic appreciation in the West and in the East, in Italy and in China. And in order to discover these roots, we must go to a deeper level, a more abstract level, and reason again in terms of semiotic ideology. So the question here is, what is the semiotic ideology behind a waterfall, and what is the semiotic ideology behind a fountain? And we can understand the difference between the two semiotic ideologies, the semiotic ideology behind the fountain and the semiotic ideology behind the waterfall, only if we consider these two objects in structural terms, in abstract terms. What is a fountain? A fountain can be many things, but in order to understand what it means in this context, we must comprehend its semiotic ideology, the semiotic ideology that it expresses, from the point of view of exactly what we were theoretically talking about before. That is agency. Agency, the ability of acting into the world, the ability of producing an effect into the world, the ability of transforming the world. So what is a fountain from the point of view of the semiotic ideology of agency? A fountain is not simply a decoration, is a human statement. It's a statement about the human ability to reverse the natural flowing of the universe. It is a statement about the human ability to contrast the laws of nature and to defeat the laws of nature, to defeat gravity. You see, the semiotic ideology of agency that is behind a waterfall, it is not so different from the semiotic ideology of agency that is behind the idea of sending a first man to the moon. This is not a Chinese idea. Of course, China now is much better than the West in conquering the space. But originally, this is not a Chinese traditional idea. The Chinese traditional culture would not send a man on the moon. This is very American. This is very US. This is very Western. The idea that we're gonna challenge gravity, we're gonna challenge the laws of the universe, and we're gonna be able to send a man over the moon. The same semiotic ideology of agency is behind a fountain. You see, a fountain does not work naturally. A fountain requires energy in order to make water contrast and defeat, at least for a while, the force of gravity. It requires energy, and it requires also engineering. It requires a device, basically a pump, that pumps water against the force of gravity. You see, water naturally does not go from the bottom up. Naturally, gravity pushes water in the other direction, from above to the bottom, from above downwards. This is why umbrellas exist, because we want to protect ourselves from water that falls naturally from the sky. So you see, when fountains are put into a Western park or a Western garden, implicitly, I'm not saying that this is an explicit statement, this is an implicit statement that is somehow enshrined into the Western aesthetic culture, but also in the Western, even more deeply, a semiotic ideology of agency. So through these fountains in a park, the Westerners are saying we can control nature, we can dominate nature, we can be stronger than nature. Human beings are above nature. We can control the elements. We can control the elements not only by building dams, but also by building fountains. We can force water to go in a direction that it would naturally go toward. This is a very un-Chinese and very atypical of Asia in general. In many Asian and I would say also in Chinese aesthetics, at least the little that I know of Chinese aesthetics that pushes me to think so, the idea to force nature to do something that it's not supposed to do, the idea of displaying the strength of agency in order to divert and invert the flowing of nature is not something that is appreciated. It is considered as a sign of arrogance. It is considered as a sign of the Greeks would call it the hubris, a sign of excessive display of confidence and power. You see, what is praised in the Chinese aesthetics is, on the contrary, the waterfall. Why? Because the waterfall, especially the artificial waterfall, the waterfall that is painting in a landscape painting in a Chinese restaurant, but also the waterfall that is artificially arranged in a Chinese park, of course it is artificial. Of course there is a human being behind it. Of course there is an engineer sometimes behind the waterfall. But this waterfall does not go against the force and the laws of nature. It actually works together with nature. It works in harmony with nature and with its laws and forces in order to give rise to this element, which is seen as beautiful exactly because in it the Chinese observer will see nature, but will also see the human being, his or her agency, working together with the agency of nature, not in contrast with it. You see, the two mindsets are completely different. On the one hand, the typical mindset of so much a Western art history, art must conquer nature, must not only imitate nature, must also somehow overcome and surpass, become better than nature in controlling the elements. On the one hand, on the other hand, a typical trend in the semiotic ideology of the Eastern and Chinese conception of agency, the artist is not supposed to subjugate nature, is not supposed to crush nature or to invert the laws of nature. It is supposed to work together with nature, to enhance what movements are already in nature, not to contrast them. You see, this is a whole cultural difference, a deep difference in the semiotic ideologies of a agency that we can understand by simply observing the ways in which parks are arranged in China and in Italy. Well, of course, then things are much more complicated because, you see, I told you already that at the end of the 18th century, fountains were introduced by Jesuit architects into China. But also, if you go to the city center of Guangzhou right now, to the new city center where all the big skyscrapers are, where the gigantic library is, at night you're gonna see a big spectacle, a spectacle that is attended by not only tourists but also the citizens of Guangzhou every night. It is the spectacle of a gigantic waterfall that pushes these immense columns of water into the sky. You're going to see the same thing also in the West Lake in Hangzhou, but these are modern things. These are actually spectacles that do not originally belong to Chinese culture. They have been imported from the West. You see, the first time that one of these fountains were world seen was during the if I remember well, 1992 Barcelona Olympic Games, where this gigantic fountain produced the spectacle of water and lights and music in Barcelona for the beginning of the Olympic Games. And the fountain is still there, although now, of course, the Chinese version is much more spectacular. But you see, if you go to the West Lake in Hangzhou or the center of Guangzhou, you're gonna come across these fountains again, but these fountains are something that has been imported recently. The music that you hear in many cases as an accompaniment of which accompanies this spectacle is not Eastern or Chinese music, you know, is Andrea Bocelli or Pavarotti or tenors singing Italian songs. So it's something that it is a beautiful spectacle, but it is a spectacle that comes from another culture, and deep down probably the Chinese person, the elder who goes to the park to find some peace and serenity and exercise, is actually still more pleased by the sight of a waterfall with water gently falling down a path that looks like a natural path, although of course it is not a completely natural path because it has been also arranged by the park designer. So you see, this is how cultural semiotics, critical semiotics works. It works by observing elements in the environment, by setting and spotting, singling out some oppositions, by building systems of these oppositions, and by trying to connect these systems of oppositions with a history on the one hand and the functioning of the entire semiosphere on the other hand. It is a very hypothetical process because, of course, I cannot demonstrate to you mathematically, I cannot mathematically demonstrate to you that my interpretation is correct. I cannot quantitatively demonstrate to you that what I've said about fountains and waterfalls is actually precise. And it would not make too much sense either to inductively count the number of fountains in Chinese parks and to count the number of waterfalls in Western parks, because you see, now the imaginaries have been somehow blurred by cultural exchange. So what is important there is that what I've just said makes sense to you. That this system, this cultural system, displaying opposite semiotic ideologies of agency that I've just described to you, doesn't actually look as entirely unreasonable, but on the contrary, looks like a reasonable proposal for interpreting more in depth the way in which Chinese culture works on the one hand, the way in which Italian or European culture works on the other hand. And now you can start from this and expand the reasoning. So you can try to see, okay, so this is probably, it might be true. So let's buy for a moment the hypothesis that Professor LEONE has just spelled out. But how can we continue this reasoning? How can we expand this argument? How can we corroborate, verify this hypothesis? Or on the contrary, how can we deny, falsify this hypothesis? So the question to ask ourselves, the way to proceed in this case is not, okay, let's count the fountains, let's count the waterfalls. This is not so interesting. The most interesting way to expand this hypothesis, and also to test this hypothesis, is to see whether this opposition of semiotic ideologies of agency is also present in other cultural elements. So let's not consider fountains as opposed to waterfalls, but let us consider other cultural aspects. In other cultural aspects, can I actually find the same opposition in other manifestations of Chinese culture as opposed to other manifestations of Italian or European culture? Can I actually see the same way of conceiving agency, of conceiving the relation between human beings and nature, between the act of a human agent and the laws of nature? Can I prolong this argument? Can I somehow show that this opposition of semiotic ideology or ideologies of agency is present also in other cultural manifestations? So this is something that you might want to do. Observe the reality that surrounds you and see whether these different ways of conceiving the place of humans in relation to nature is somehow present also in other cultural manifestations. You see, this is something that might concern not only, let's say, everyday life and popular culture, but also the arts. If you look into traditional Asian paintings, not only in China but also in Japan, if you look, for instance, at the paintings that were executed in 17th century Japan by Sotatsu, for instance, well, you're going to come across many representations of dragons. And dragons in Sotatsu's paintings are usually arranged in a way that they compose a sort of a yin and yang. So there is one above and one below, and they are in a shape such that the head of one is in correspondence to the tail of the other. And the Western observer will look at this painting and will recognize in that painting two dragons somehow fighting in the sky. But a 17th century Japanese observer would look at that painting, would see the two dragons, one on top of the other, creating a sort of irregular circle, and would think immediately that that was water in nature. This is how water behaves in nature. It behaves like two dragons that are constantly connected with each other, because water constantly, it is somehow traveling from the sky downwards through the phenomenon of rain or snow, but it is also traveling backwards and upwards through the natural evaporation of water that recreates clouds. So it is not actually completely true that the waterfall symbolizes the only idea of agency, natural agency in the Chinese aesthetics. You know, in Asian aesthetics, in these Japanese paintings, you're going to come across the idea that actually this natural element flows into a sort of a never-ending circle that brings rain down to the earth, but it also brings back water to the sky. And this can perfectly be visualized by these two dragons that are not actually fighting with each other, but they are complementing harmoniously their forces, their energies, their directions. So, you see, by expanding our observation of everyday cultural elements with the study of how these everyday cultural elements have been subsumed, have been distilled, and have been articulated in a sophisticated way into the highbrow arts, painting for instance, we can understand that our own comprehension must be nuanced even more, and must be adapted also to the subtle articulations of the aesthetics that we are observing and whose meaning we are trying to comprehend at a very deep level, at the level not only of perception, conception of beauty, but in order to understand how the very roots of this beauty are created. So this is again just a simple example, but we're going to now proceed to the third part of the class. As always, we have a guest. This guest is a brilliant professor from the University of Turin who has been already in Shanghai many times, both personally and virtually. His name is Gabriele Marino. He has been teaching also at other, not only at Shanghai University, but also in other Chinese university, Jinan University, for instance. He's a brilliant semiotician. He's a semiotician who is a specialist in many things, on general semiotics, semiotics of memes, semiotics of digital cultures, and semiotics of music. So his intervention will be very important, not only because he's the writer and author of many articles and books. One of his books, a monumental one, is about to be published in Italy. Despite his young age, Gabriele Marino has a very long bibliography, but also because music is another cultural manifestation of human beings in which semiotic ideology is always present, in which we can distinguish different conceptions of agency. What is a semiotic? What is an instrument, for instance, in music? Why do we call the tools through which we make music instruments? And is that still a correct definition nowadays, that computers can make music on their own? But also as regards authenticity, because you see, we are not going to talk only about semiotic ideologies of agency, the capacity of acting into the world, but also about semiotic ideologies of individuality, singularity, authenticity. What is authentic in a culture? What is considered as singular, as individual? What is considered as a copy? You know, there are many misunderstandings between the East and the West as regards authenticity, as regards singularity. So this was just a very short introduction to introduce Gabriele Marino, who's a professor at the University of Turin, who's going to give a talk about the cultural semiotics of music and the semiotic ideologies of music. I'm sure that he has also examples from the East, not only from the West. I see that he's already present among the participants of the seminar, this advanced seminar. For the moment, I thank you very much for your attention. We're going to take a 10 minutes break. It's now the hour here. So at exactly past 10, Professor Marino will appear on the screen and we'll continue with the third part of our lesson. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you in exactly 10 minutes.